September 16, 1959, Rochester, New York. Nikolai Heinrichsen, 42, deputy cultural attaché from the Soviet embassy, stood frozen in the automatic glass doors of an American supermarket, his briefcase trembling in his grip. What he witnessed defied everything he had been taught about capitalist decay and American poverty. Instead of the struggling masses he expected to encounter, shelves stretched endlessly in every direction, bursting with more food varieties than he had seen in his entire lifetime. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, illuminating towers of oranges from Florida, apples from Washington, and tropical fruits he couldn't even identify. The sweet aroma of fresh bread mixed with the crisp scent of refrigerated produce filled the air. Heinrichsen understood in that devastating moment that everything his government had told him about American scarcity was catastrophically wrong. This moment would shatter not only his worldview, but signaled the beginning of an ideological crisis that would ripple through the highest levels of Soviet leadership. Before we explore how this revelation changed everything for these Soviet officials, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. We love hearing from viewers around the world who are fascinated by these untold stories of human discovery during the intense Cold War period. The story begins 3 weeks earlier, when the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs selected a delegation of 12 diplomats and cultural attachés for an unprecedented goodwill tour of American cities. Heinrichsen, born in Königsberg before it became Kaliningrad, had spent his entire adult career crafting propaganda about American economic failures. His specialty was documenting unemployment lines and urban decay for Soviet publications. He genuinely believed that Americans survived on government rations and that Western abundance was an elaborate Hollywood fabrication designed to fool the world. His colleague, Victor Steinbach, 38, from Leipzig before the war, served as the delegation's economic observer. Steinbach carried detailed notes about American production statistics that Soviet intelligence had dismissed as capitalist lies. According to official Soviet briefings, America produced roughly the same agricultural output as the USSR, but hoarded it among the wealthy elite while workers starved. The delegation had been instructed to document evidence of this inequality, photographing bread lines and empty store shelves to prove Soviet superiority. The prevailing narrative in Moscow painted America as a nation teetering on economic collapse, where ordinary citizens could barely afford basic necessities. Soviet newspapers regularly featured stories about American children going hungry while millionaires wasted food. Pravda had published statistics showing that average Americans consumed fewer calories per day than Soviet workers, and that capitalist inefficiency meant most food rotted in warehouses while people suffered. These weren't just propaganda talking points for Heinrichsen and his colleagues, they were accepted facts that shaped every aspect of their worldview. The delegation expected to find confirmation of everything they had been taught. They anticipated visiting small, poorly stocked shops where limited goods sat behind locked counters, requiring special permission to purchase. They prepared cameras to document the sparse selections and dejected faces of American consumers. Steinbach had even practiced sympathetic expressions for when he encountered malnourished American workers, planning to offer quiet solidarity with their struggle against capitalist oppression. When their Greyhound bus pulled up to the Wegmans supermarket in Rochester, Heinrichsen assumed it was some sort of government showcase. The building itself seemed impossibly large, with a parking lot that could accommodate hundreds of vehicles. Even the parking lot appeared more prosperous than most Soviet shopping districts, with families casually loading groceries into private automobiles. The sight of so many ordinary citizens owning cars already challenged everything he believed about American poverty, but he rationalized it as elaborate theatrical staging by the CIA. As the automatic doors whispered open, revealing the cathedral-like interior of the supermarket, Heinrichsen felt his carefully constructed worldview beginning to crack. The sheer scale overwhelmed his senses. Aisle after aisle stretched into the distance, each one containing more variety than existed in entire Soviet cities. The produce section alone displayed dozens of apple varieties, when most Soviet citizens considered themselves fortunate to find any apples at all. Mountains of bananas, a luxury he had tasted perhaps 3 times in his life, sat casually accessible to anyone with pocket change. Steinbach stood beside him, frantically scribbling notes that made no sense. His prepared categories for documenting scarcity, rationing systems, and evidence of hunger became utterly useless. Instead, he found himself writing observations that seemed like fantasy. 73 varieties of breakfast cereal, entire aisle devoted solely to ice cream flavors. Fresh flowers sold as casual purchases, not special occasion luxuries. His handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the magnitude of his misconceptions became apparent. The other delegation members wandered the aisles in similar states of shock. Maria Rothschild, the group's photographer, had brought multiple rolls of film specifically to document American poverty. Instead, she found herself photographing abundance so extreme it appeared almost obscene. Her camera captured American housewives casually selecting from dozens of soap brands, debating between competing breakfast options, filling massive shopping carts with enough food to feed Soviet families for weeks. What disturbed Heinrichsen most wasn't just the quantity of available goods, but the casual attitude Americans displayed toward this abundance. Children complained about cereal choices, teenagers dismissed perfectly good clothing as unfashionable. Families debated restaurant options as if eating out was a routine decision rather than a once-yearly celebration. The delegation witnessed abundance so normalized that Americans seemed genuinely unaware of how extraordinary their circumstances appeared to foreign eyes. The contrast with Soviet shopping experiences was stark beyond comprehension. In Moscow, Heinrichsen typically spent hours queuing for basic necessities, often leaving empty-handed when supplies ran out. Here, Americans moved efficiently through checkouts, paying for overflowing carts of goods with casual confidence that everything would be restocked tomorrow. The concept of shopping as a pleasant leisure activity rather than a stressful survival necessity fundamentally challenged everything Soviet ideology taught about capitalist economics. As the delegation spent their first hour in this temple of consumption, the comfortable certainties that had guided their entire careers beginning to dissolve. The evidence surrounding them was too overwhelming to dismiss as propaganda or special staging. This was ordinary American retail, accessible to regular citizens on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The implications of this reality would force them to confront uncomfortable questions about everything they had been taught, everything they had believed, and everything they had spent their lives defending about the Soviet system. But something began to change as they moved deeper into the store. Heinrichsen found himself approaching ordinary American shoppers, desperately seeking some explanation that might preserve his worldview. He struck up a conversation with Margaret Thompson, a 34-year-old housewife from nearby Brighton, who was selecting frozen vegetables with her 2 young children. Through their interpreter, Heinrichsen asked if this supermarket was somehow special, perhaps reserved for wealthy Americans or government officials. Margaret laughed warmly, assuming he was joking. "Oh no, this is just our regular Wegmans. There are 3 others just like it within 10 miles of here. We usually shop at the one closer to home, but they had a sale on roast beef here today." She gestured casually toward a meat counter that displayed more protein than most Soviet cities saw in a month. The kids prefer this one anyway, because it has a bigger candy section. The translator hesitated before relaying Margaret's words, understanding their devastating implications. Steinbach scribbled frantically, noting that this apparently ordinary American housewife spoke of 4 identical supermarkets within a small radius, each offering comparable abundance. His economic training told him this was impossible. Soviet central planning struggled to adequately supply single stores in major cities, yet Americans maintained multiple competing establishments overflowing with goods. Margaret's casual mention of sales and competitive pricing introduced another concept that shattered Soviet understanding. In their system, goods were either available or not, priced according to state decree. The idea that stores competed by offering lower prices and that consumers could choose where to shop based on these competitions revealed a market dynamic that official Soviet economics denied could exist. Heinrichsen asked Margaret about her husband's occupation, expecting to learn that he held some position of privilege that provided access to special stores. "He's an electrician for Rochester Gas and Electric," she replied matter-of-factly. "Union job, steady work. We're saving up for a bigger house now that the kids are getting older." An electrician? A skilled worker, certainly, but hardly a member of the capitalist elite that Soviet propaganda claimed monopolized American abundance. As Margaret loaded her cart with items that would have been impossible luxuries in the Soviet Union, her children complained about having to choose between different varieties of breakfast pastry. "Can we get both the chocolate chip and the blueberry muffins?" asked her 7-year-old daughter. Margaret sighed with the patience of a parent dealing with routine decision-making. "Pick one for today, honey. We'll get the other kind next week." Next week? The casual assumption that this abundance would continue, that these choices would remain available, that shopping was a repeatable experience rather than a rare opportunity, fundamentally challenged everything the Soviet delegation understood about economic planning. In their experience, finding desired goods required luck, connections, or both. The concept of postponing a purchase because you could reliably return later for the same selection was revolutionary. Victor Steinbach approached the store manager, hoping to understand the logistics behind this apparent miracle of distribution. Frank Mueller, 46, had worked in grocery retail for 23 years, starting as a stockboy and working his way up through hard work and company loyalty. Mueller was happy to explain his operation to the Soviet visitors, proud of his store's efficiency and customer service reputation. "We receive deliveries 6 days a week," Mueller explained through the interpreter. "Fresh produce comes in daily from farms across the country. California lettuce and oranges arrive every Tuesday and Friday. Florida citrus comes in Wednesday and Saturday. We work with over 200 suppliers to maintain our selection." He gestured toward the produce section where employees were arranging fresh strawberries from 3 different farms, allowing customers to compare quality and choose their preference. 200 suppliers! Steinbach's mind struggled to process this number. The entire Soviet Union, spanning 11 time zones and containing nearly 250 million people, could not reliably coordinate supply chains with 200 different producers. Yet this single American store managed complex logistics involving hundreds of businesses, maintaining consistent availability across thousands of products. Mueller continued his explanation, oblivious to the ideological earthquake he was creating. "Customer satisfaction is our top priority. If someone wants a product we don't carry, we'll special order it. If they're not happy with their purchase, we have a full refund policy, no questions asked." Competition keeps us honest. There are 4 other supermarkets within 5 miles, so we have to earn every customer's business. The concept of customer satisfaction as a driving economic force was alien to Soviet thinking. In their system, citizens were grateful for whatever goods became available. Stores existed to distribute products according to state planning, not to please individual consumers. The idea that businesses competed for customer approval and that this competition somehow resulted in better service and greater abundance contradicted fundamental Marxist economic theory. Mueller offered to show them the storage areas and receiving docks, eager to demonstrate American efficiency to foreign guests. The back of the store revealed another layer of sophisticated organization. Computer printouts tracked inventory levels for thousands of items. Delivery schedules were coordinated with surgical precision. Refrigerated trucks arrived throughout the day, maintaining cold chains that preserved product quality from farm to consumer. Heinrichsen examined invoices and delivery schedules that documented a supply network of staggering complexity. Milk arrived from 12 different dairies. Bread came from 8 bakeries. Meat was sourced from processing plants across multiple states. Yet somehow, this intricate web of private businesses coordinated their efforts to maintain consistent availability. No central planning bureau directed these operations. No 5-year plan determined production quotas. The system appeared to organize itself through mechanisms the Soviet delegation could not comprehend. The journey to this moment of revelation began with the delegation's second supermarket visit 3 days later in Buffalo, New York. Heinrichsen had convinced himself that the Rochester store was somehow exceptional, perhaps a showcase designed to impress foreign visitors. He clung to the hope that normal American shopping would reveal the scarcity and suffering that Soviet intelligence assured him existed throughout capitalist society. The Buffalo supermarket destroyed this final rationalization completely. If anything, this store displayed even greater abundance than the first. The selection was broader, the displays more elaborate, and the customers more numerous. Families moved through aisles with practiced efficiency, filling multiple carts with casual confidence. Children ran ahead to select favorite cereals while parents debated dinner options from dozens of possibilities. Steinbach documented statistics that seemed impossible to believe. This single store offered 127 varieties of breakfast cereal, 43 different laundry detergents, and 67 brands of shampoo. The meat department displayed 23 cuts of beef, 18 varieties of chicken preparation, and 31 types of seafood, including lobsters swimming in tanks that customers could select personally. An entire aisle was devoted exclusively to pet food, with specialized nutrition for different breeds, ages, and health conditions. The pet food aisle particularly disturbed the Soviet visitors. In their country, pets were rare luxuries that most families could not afford to maintain. The concept of specialized animal nutrition, with premium products costing more than many Soviet workers earned in a day, revealed a level of prosperity that extended beyond human needs into pure indulgence. Americans were literally feeding their animals better than many Soviet citizens could feed themselves. Maria Rothschild photographed price tags that told devastating stories about American purchasing power. A factory worker earning average wages could afford a week's worth of groceries with less than a day's salary. Luxury items that would require months of saving in the Soviet Union were priced as impulse purchases. A bottle of imported wine cost less than most Americans earned in an hour. Designer clothing was marked down for clearance because newer fashions had arrived. What happened next surprised everyone, including the American hosts. Instead of requesting visits to cultural sites or government buildings, the Soviet delegation asked to see more supermarkets. They wanted to understand if the abundance they witnessed was truly representative of ordinary American commerce, or if they had somehow been directed to exceptional establishments. Their American escorts, initially confused by this unusual interest in mundane shopping, gladly accommodated the request. Over the following week, the delegation visited 17 different supermarkets across Western New York. Each store confirmed the same impossible truth. American abundance was not exceptional, but routine. Whether in wealthy suburbs or working-class neighborhoods, the basic pattern remained consistent. Overflowing shelves, vast selection, competitive pricing, and casual consumer confidence that everything would be restocked tomorrow. By September 23rd, the situation had evolved from professional curiosity to personal crisis for several delegation members. Heinrichsen found himself lying awake in his hotel room, staring at the ceiling and trying to reconcile what he had witnessed with everything he had spent his career defending. His entire professional identity was built on documenting American failures and Soviet successes. How could he return to Moscow and continue writing propaganda about capitalist scarcity when he had seen capitalist abundance with his own eyes? The real shock came when they visited a discount supermarket chain that catered specifically to budget-conscious shoppers. Even this establishment, designed for families with limited incomes, offered selection that exceeded most premium Soviet stores. The generic products, packaged in plain white boxes with simple black lettering, provided quality comparable to Soviet luxury goods, at prices that made them accessible to welfare recipients and minimum wage workers. Steinbach interviewed customers at this discount store, hoping to find evidence of the economic hardship that Soviet theory predicted. Instead, he met the Kowalski family, Polish immigrants who had arrived in America just 2 years earlier with nothing but hope and determination. Robert Kowalski, 29, worked 2 jobs, driving a delivery truck during the day and cleaning offices at night. His wife Anna, 26, cared for their 3 young children while taking English classes at a local community center. In Poland, we stood in lines for hours hoping to buy bread, Anna explained through tears of gratitude. Here, my children complain if I buy the wrong brand of breakfast cereal. They have choices I never dreamed possible. Even shopping at this discount store, we eat better than we did in Warsaw when Robert had a good job at the shipyard. The Kowalski family's story demolished another pillar of Soviet ideology. According to Marxist theory, immigrants to capitalist countries should face exploitation and poverty, their labor extracted by wealthy owners while they struggled to survive. Instead, this working-class family had achieved in 2 years a standard of living that exceeded what most Soviet professionals enjoyed after decades of loyal service to the state. Robert Kowalski's 2 jobs, which Soviet propaganda would characterize as capitalist exploitation, actually provided him with opportunities that simply did not exist in communist countries. His daytime employer offered health insurance, paid vacation time, and performance bonuses. His evening job was helping him save money to eventually start his own small business, a dream that was impossible under central planning but achievable in America's entrepreneurial economy. Perhaps most devastating was the children's casual attitude toward abundance. The 3 Kowalski children, ages 4, 6, and 8, had already adapted to American consumption patterns. They debated breakfast choices, requested specific brands of clothing, and assumed that desired toys would be available for birthdays and Christmas. In less than 2 years, they had internalized assumptions about availability and choice that Soviet children never developed even in privileged families. Anna Kowalski showed the delegation photographs from their Polish relatives who had sent pictures of empty store shelves and ration cards as evidence of continuing hardship under communist rule. The contrast was brutal and undeniable. While communist Poland struggled to provide basic necessities for its citizens, Polish immigrants in America were debating between different brands of luxury items. The delegation's American interpreter, James Bradley, 31, noticed the profound impact these visits were having on his Soviet guests. Bradley had studied Russian language and culture at Yale University, preparing for a career in diplomatic service. He understood enough about Soviet society to recognize the ideological earthquake that was reshaping these visitors' worldview. "I could see it in their faces," Bradley later wrote in a confidential State Department report. These weren't just diplomatic observers gathering intelligence, they were true believers confronting evidence that their entire belief system was fundamentally flawed. Several delegation members stopped taking notes after the 4th or 5th supermarket visit. They just wandered the aisles in silence, trying to process what they were seeing. Bradley observed that the Soviet visitors had stopped asking about government food distribution programs or state-controlled pricing mechanisms. Instead, they focused on understanding how private businesses could coordinate such complex supply chains without central planning. They seemed genuinely puzzled by the concept of voluntary cooperation between competing companies, suppliers, and customers. The accumulating weight of evidence was becoming impossible to ignore or rationalize away. These were not showcase stores or propaganda displays. This was ordinary American commerce, accessible to ordinary American citizens, operating efficiently without government control or central planning. The implications for everything the delegation believed about economic systems were staggering and unavoidable. The tipping point came during their final supermarket visit in Syracuse, New York on September 28, 1959. Dr. Elena Beckman, 44, the delegation's senior economic analyst, had maintained professional composure throughout the previous visits by focusing on technical questions about supply chain logistics and inventory management. She carried detailed clipboards filled with forms designed to document evidence of capitalist inefficiency and waste. Instead, Beckman found herself documenting a level of economic coordination that surpassed anything achieved by Soviet central planning. The supermarket's computer system tracked sales patterns, automatically generating orders to suppliers when stock levels decreased. Seasonal adjustments increased availability of popular items during holidays and special events. Customer feedback influenced purchasing decisions, with store managers adding new products based on shopper requests. "This cannot be the same economic system we were told about," Beckman whispered to Heinrichsen as they observed the store's receiving area during the morning delivery rush. Trucks arrived in 15-minute intervals, each carrying precisely ordered merchandise that store employees quickly sorted and shelved. The coordination was so efficient that products never remained in storage areas longer than necessary, yet store shelves never appeared empty or understocked. The numbers seemed impossible, yet the evidence surrounded them. While the Soviet Union, with its centralized planning apparatus and vast bureaucracy, struggled to maintain adequate food distribution for major cities, this single American supermarket received and processed more variety in one day than most Soviet stores handled in an entire month. The efficiency achieved through voluntary market coordination exceeded what Soviet planners accomplished through detailed state control. Beckman interviewed Carol Steinfeld, 52, the store's head buyer, who explained her decision-making process with casual confidence. "I look at last year's sales data for guidance, but mostly I talk to customers and watch what they're buying. If people ask for something we don't carry, I'll call suppliers to see if we can get it. Sometimes I try new products just to see how customers respond. If something doesn't sell, we discontinue it and try something else." The concept of experimental decision-making, where individual store managers could test new ideas and adjust based on customer response, was revolutionary to Soviet thinking. Their system required months of bureaucratic approval for any changes in product selection or store operations. Store managers were instructed to follow central directives, not to experiment with customer preferences or market conditions. Steinfeld's casual authority over purchasing decisions, her direct contact with suppliers, and her ability to respond quickly to customer demands represented a level of economic flexibility that Soviet central planning could never match. She operated with entrepreneurial freedom that exceeded what most Soviet factory directors enjoyed, despite managing only a single retail establishment. The most devastating revelation came when Beckman asked about product shortages and rationing systems. Steinfeld looked genuinely confused by the question, requiring several attempts at translation before understanding what the Soviet economist wanted to know. "Shortages? We very rarely run completely out of anything. If we do, customers can ask us to call other stores in the chain to locate what they need, or we can special order it for next week's delivery." Rationing systems were equally foreign to American retail experience. "People buy what they want, when they want it, in whatever quantities they prefer," Steinfeld explained patiently. "If someone wants to buy 50 cans of soup because it's on sale, that's their choice. If another customer wants just 1 can, that's fine too. We stock enough to meet demand, and if we miscalculate, we adjust our orders for next time." The casual assumption that supply would always meet demand, that customers could purchase desired quantities without restriction, and that mistakes in planning would be quickly corrected through market feedback, revealed an economic system operating on principles completely opposite to Soviet methodology. Heinrichsen watched American families shopping without any apparent anxiety about availability or rationing. Parents sent children to collect specific items, confident that everything on their lists would be in stock. Teenagers browsed leisurely, debating between different brands and sizes. Elderly customers compared prices and quality, taking time to make careful decisions without worry that desired products would disappear while they deliberated. This relaxed shopping behavior contrasted sharply with Soviet consumer psychology, where finding desired goods required constant vigilance, quick decision-making, and acceptance of whatever was available. Soviet shoppers developed habits of purchasing immediately when something appeared in stores, regardless of immediate need, because they could never predict when it would be available again. The delegation spent their final afternoon documenting comparative statistics that told a story of overwhelming American advantage. The average American supermarket carried 3,000 to 5,000 different products. A typical Soviet grocery store offered perhaps 200 items, many of which were frequently unavailable. American stores received deliveries 6 days per week. Soviet stores might receive deliveries twice monthly with unpredictable timing and quantities. American consumers spent approximately 10% of their income on food, leaving 90% available for other purchases. Soviet citizens typically spent 40 to 50% of their income on food and still experienced shortages and dietary limitations. The typical American grocery budget could purchase luxury items that were completely unavailable to Soviet consumers at any price. Victor Steinbach calculated that an average American factory worker could afford more meat in 1 week than a Soviet factory worker could purchase in 2 months. An American minimum wage employee could buy more fresh fruit in a single shopping trip than most Soviet professionals saw in an entire year. These comparisons were not propaganda or capitalist exaggeration. They were mathematical facts based on direct observation and documented prices. Perhaps most significantly, the delegation realized that American abundance was not the result of government planning or state control, but emerged from voluntary cooperation between millions of independent businesses, farmers, manufacturers, and consumers. No central authority directed this complex coordination. No 5-year plan determined product availability. The system organized itself through market mechanisms that Soviet economic theory claimed were impossible. The psychological impact of these revelations varied among delegation members, but none remained unchanged by the experience. Some, like Heinrichsen, fell into profound depression as they contemplated the implications for everything they had believed and taught. Others, like Steinbach, became energized by the possibility that different economic approaches might offer better outcomes for their own people. Dr. Beckman adopted a more analytical approach, filling notebooks with detailed observations and questions that challenged fundamental assumptions about economic organization. If markets can coordinate complex supply chains more efficiently than central planning, she wrote privately, what does this mean for everything we have been trying to achieve? Are we pursuing the wrong methods to reach the right goals, or are even our goals misconceived? As their American tour concluded and the delegation prepared to return to Moscow, each member faced a personal crisis that extended far beyond professional responsibilities. They had witnessed evidence that contradicted not just Soviet propaganda, but the entire theoretical foundation of the communist economic system. The comfortable certainties that had guided their careers and personal beliefs lay in ruins, replaced by uncomfortable questions about everything they had devoted their lives to defending. The flight back to Moscow on October 2, 1959, was marked by unusual silence among delegation members who had spent 3 weeks confronting the collapse of their fundamental beliefs about economic systems and American society. Heinrichsen sat by the airplane window, watching American farmland stretch endlessly below, dotted with prosperous-looking farms and small towns that contradicted everything Soviet propaganda had taught him about rural poverty and agricultural failure under capitalism. During the long journey home, the delegation members began processing the magnitude of their experience and its implications for their future careers and personal beliefs. Dr. Beckman filled her remaining notebooks with economic calculations that painted an undeniable picture of Soviet disadvantage. By every measurable standard of material prosperity, consumer choice, and economic efficiency, the American system they had witnessed surpassed Soviet achievements by enormous margins. The aftermath of their American experience would prove as dramatic as the original revelation. Upon returning to Moscow, several delegation members found themselves unable to resume their previous duties with conviction. Heinrichsen, who had built his career writing propaganda about American economic failures, submitted a resignation letter from his position at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs just 2 weeks after his return. "I cannot continue writing reports that contradict what I have seen with my own eyes," Heinrichsen explained in his private diary, which was discovered years later by researchers studying Soviet archives. "The American people are not suffering under capitalist oppression. They are prospering in ways that our system has never achieved and apparently never will achieve. To continue spreading lies about American poverty would make me complicit in deceiving the Soviet people about the true nature of our comparative economic performance." Victor Steinbach chose a different path, requesting reassignment to economic research positions where he could study market mechanisms and supply chain coordination. His subsequent reports, carefully worded to avoid direct criticism of Soviet planning, introduced concepts from American retail management that slowly influenced Soviet economic thinking during the 1960s and 1970s. Though he never openly advocated for capitalist methods, his work planted seeds that would eventually contribute to economic reforms during the Gorbachev era. Dr. Beckman's response proved most significant for long-term Soviet policy development. She began quietly conducting comparative studies of socialist and capitalist economic performance, building networks of economists who shared her concerns about central planning inefficiencies. Her research group would eventually influence younger Soviet leaders who came to power in the 1980s, contributing to the economic reforms that preceded the Soviet Union's eventual collapse. The American supermarket experience created a crisis of faith that extended beyond economic theory into personal philosophy and political loyalty. These were not casual observers or cynical opportunists seeking personal advantage. They were true believers who had devoted their lives to communist ideals, only to discover that the system they championed was failing its people in fundamental ways. Maria Rothschild, the delegation's photographer, faced perhaps the most immediate professional crisis. Her photographs documented American abundance so dramatically that they could not be published in Soviet media without contradicting official narratives about capitalist failure. The images she had captured, intended to reveal American poverty and inequality, instead provided overwhelming evidence of prosperity and consumer satisfaction. Years later, during glasnost reforms of the 1980s, some of Rothschild's photographs were finally published in Soviet magazines, accompanied by articles acknowledging that previous reports about American economic conditions had been inaccurate. These images played a role in preparing Soviet citizens for the economic reforms that would attempt to introduce market mechanisms into the socialist system. The delegation's American hosts, initially puzzled by their intense focus on grocery shopping, gradually understood the profound impact their visits were having on Soviet perceptions. James Bradley, their State Department interpreter, wrote in his confidential reports that the supermarket visits had accomplished more in terms of ideological influence than years of formal diplomatic negotiations. These Soviet officials weren't just observing American retail practices, Bradley noted. They were witnessing the collapse of their own economic worldview. The abundance and efficiency they encountered challenged every assumption they had been taught about capitalist systems. I believe this experience will influence Soviet policy thinking for years to come, as these individuals return to Moscow and attempt to reconcile what they have seen with their previous beliefs. Bradley's prediction proved remarkably accurate. Several delegation members went on to influence Soviet economic policy during the 1970s and 1980s, contributing to reforms that attempted to introduce market incentives and consumer responsiveness into the planned economy. While these efforts ultimately proved insufficient to save the Soviet system, they demonstrated the lasting impact of direct exposure to capitalist abundance. The broader implications of the delegation's experience extended beyond individual career changes to influence Soviet understanding of the global ideological competition. The comfortable assumption that socialism would inevitably triumph over capitalism through superior economic performance was shattered by direct observation of capitalist success. This forced Soviet leadership to reconsider their strategies for competing with the West and supporting communist movements worldwide. In subsequent years, other Soviet delegations visiting Western countries were more carefully prepared for the abundance they would encounter, and their itineraries were designed to minimize exposure to consumer retail environments. The spontaneous revelation experienced by the 1959 delegation was never allowed to occur again, as Soviet officials recognized the ideological danger posed by unfiltered contact with capitalist prosperity. The story of these Soviet diplomats and their transformative encounter with American supermarkets illustrates the power of direct experience to challenge ideological certainties and reshape fundamental beliefs. Their journey from confident propagandists to questioning reformers demonstrates how exposure to different economic systems can create unexpected advocates for change within authoritarian societies. Years later, as the Soviet Union collapsed and Eastern European countries transitioned to market economies, the experiences of this delegation took on historical significance. Their early recognition of market economy advantages presaged the systemic changes that would eventually sweep the communist world. The supermarket visits that seemed like routine diplomatic activities in 1959 had planted intellectual seeds that contributed to the eventual transformation of the global political landscape. Heinrichsen, writing in his private papers during the 1970s, reflected on the lasting impact of those September days in American supermarkets. "I thought I was documenting enemy propaganda and capitalist deception. Instead, I discovered that we had been deceiving ourselves about the fundamental nature of economic prosperity and human satisfaction. The abundance I witnessed was not an illusion or a temporary anomaly. It was the natural result of economic freedom and voluntary cooperation, principles our system had rejected in favor of central control and ideological purity." The delegation's experience represented more than individual enlightenment. It symbolized the beginning of an intellectual awakening that would gradually spread through Soviet society over the following decades. Their encounter with American abundance planted questions that could not be easily answered within the framework of Marxist economic theory, forcing a generation of Soviet thinkers to grapple with uncomfortable truths about their system's limitations. For the American families they encountered during those supermarket visits, the presence of Soviet observers was merely a curious footnote to routine shopping experiences. Margaret Thompson continued selecting groceries for her electrician husband and 2 children, unaware that her casual confidence in American abundance had shattered the worldview of foreign visitors. Carol Steinfeld kept managing her store's purchasing decisions, not knowing that her entrepreneurial authority had revealed the flexibility and responsiveness that central planning could never achieve. The Kowalski family, Polish immigrants whose gratitude for American opportunities had moved the Soviet delegation to tears, eventually achieved their dream of small business ownership. Robert's savings from his 2 jobs allowed him to purchase a small restaurant, which became a gathering place for other Eastern European immigrants who shared similar stories of transformation and opportunity. Their success embodied the economic mobility and entrepreneurial possibility that Soviet theory claimed was impossible under capitalism. These ordinary American families, through their unconscious demonstration of prosperity and freedom, had accomplished what no diplomatic negotiation or propaganda campaign could achieve. They had forced dedicated communist officials to confront the reality that their ideological enemies were not suffering under capitalist oppression, but thriving in ways that communist systems had never successfully replicated. The supermarket visits of 1959 would later be remembered as a pivotal moment in the Cold War's ideological competition, not because of any dramatic confrontation or political declaration, but because they provided undeniable evidence about the comparative performance of economic systems. The abundance that Soviet visitors encountered was not military strength or political rhetoric, but the peaceful prosperity of ordinary citizens living their daily lives. In final analysis, the delegation's transformation from confident propagandists to questioning reformers illustrated a fundamental truth about ideological competition during the Cold War era. While both superpowers invested enormous resources in military technologies and political influence, the ultimate contest was decided by which system could better provide for the material and spiritual needs of its people. The fluorescent-lit aisles of American supermarkets, with their overflowing shelves and confident shoppers, had delivered a verdict that no political theory could overturn. The Soviet visitors had witnessed not just capitalist success, but communist failure measured in the most basic terms of human satisfaction and economic prosperity. Their personal transformations presaged the larger historical transformation that would reshape the global political landscape within a generation. For Heinrichsen, Steinbach, Beckman, and their colleagues, the lesson was both humbling and liberating. That preconceptions, however deeply held, must yield to evidence, and that the pursuit of truth requires the courage to abandon comfortable lies. Their journey from the certainties of communist ideology to the uncomfortable questions of market reality demonstrated that even the most dedicated believers could be transformed by direct encounter with alternative possibilities. The story contained within those September supermarket visits represented more than historical curiosity. It revealed the power of ordinary prosperity to challenge extraordinary claims, and the capacity of individual experience to reshape collective understanding. In the end, the abundance they discovered was both material and intellectual, offering not just better living standards, but better ways of thinking about human potential and economic organization.